In the quiet village of Barafpur, nestled among the hills and the whispering winds of rural India, lived a young girl named Meera. The world around her was simple: patchwork fields of golden wheat, lush green forests, and the serene blue skies. To an outsider, it seemed as though time stood still, untouched by the noise of modern life. But to Meera, this world was everything. It was where her heart found its rhythm, where every season brought new joys and small challenges. Her family, though not wealthy, was filled with warmth. Meera's father, Devraj, was a farmer, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose rough hands told the story of years spent tilling the land. Her mother, Shanti, was the heart of their home. With her graceful hands, she prepared meals with love, sang lullabies at night, and taught Meera the importance of kindness, humility, and resilience. As the eldest of three children, Meera had always known that responsibility came with the territory. Her younger brother, Arun, and her baby sister, Lila, often relied on her to play, protect, and sometimes even care for them. But it wasn't a burden. It was love, pure and simple. Her days began early. Meera would wake at the crack of dawn, the first rays of sunlight gently stirring her from her sleep. The smell of fresh earth and the promise of a new day always greeted her. She would start the fire to boil water for tea, help her mother with breakfast, and then rush out to the fields alongside her father. The work was tough for someone so young, but it was fulfilling. She learned how to pull weeds from between rows of crops, plant seeds, and gather harvests with hands that grew rough over the years. Her mother always encouraged her, saying, "Meera, there is no work too small. Each task teaches you something about life. Even the dirt beneath your feet holds a lesson." It was wisdom that Meera absorbed without question. But when Meera turned 10, the balance of their home was shattered. It happened one fateful summer, the time when the sun blazed relentlessly in the sky and the air was thick with heat. Shanti, her mother, who had always been the picture of vitality, suddenly fell ill. It started with a cough, soft at first, but soon growing deeper and more persistent. Meera's father brushed it off, assuming it was just a seasonal cold, but when Shanti's face grew pale and her body too weak to move, there was no denying the gravity of the situation. For the first time, the strength of their home seemed to falter. Meera's father hurried into town to seek help from the local healer, but Shanti's condition worsened each day. Meera, though terrified, stepped up. She assumed responsibilities that no child should have to bear. She made sure Arun and Lila were fed, bathed, and put to bed each night. She would fetch water from the well, clean the house, and prepare meals, all while sitting by her mother's side, holding her hand, whispering soothing words even when she herself was afraid. As the days wore on, Meera's fear grew. The healer arrived, but despite his efforts, he could not cure her mother. The diagnosis was grim. Shani had a severe chest infection, a common illness that was often fatal if left untreated. With the nearest hospital many miles away and no money for proper treatment, it felt like the world was closing in on their small family. Meera was forced to grow up in ways she had never imagined. There were no more carefree moments. No more days spent running through the fields with her friends. Every moment was consumed with worry for her mother's health and the weight of the household responsibilities. Despite all the pain, something inside Meera shifted. She learned quickly that survival and love often meant doing the hard things even when you didn't want to. There was no time for self-pity. As her mother grew weaker, Meera's resolve grew stronger. Her hands, once soft and tender, became calloused from the constant work. Her heart, too, became stronger, hardened by the challenges that life threw at her. One evening, after a long day of work, Meera sat by her mother's bedside, exhausted. Shanti's breathing was shallow, but her eyes still held the warmth they always had. She smiled weakly at her daughter. "Meera," she whispered, "you are the strength of this house. You have a heart full of courage." Those words became Meera's mantra. As her mother's health continued to decline, Meera knew that she had to hold the family together. She could not falter. She would not falter. And when her mother passed away quietly in the early morning hours, with the first rays of light breaking through the window, Meera was ready. She had learned that life wasn't just about living in the moments of joy. It was about surviving the moments of pain, embracing them, and learning from them. Her mother's death, though heart-wrenching, did not break her. Instead, it made her stronger. Meera's journey had just begun. As the weeks passed, the village rallied around the grieving family. But Meera, though young, held everything together. Her father, devastated by the loss of his wife, leaned on Meera, who quietly took on the role of caretaker for her siblings. Arun, too young to fully understand, found comfort in Meera's presence, while Lila clung to her older sister's skirts, sensing the void left by their mother. This chapter in Meera's life marked the beginning of something much greater. She had learned, perhaps too early, that life was full of heartache, but it was also full of lessons. And resilience, she understood, was not something you were born with. It was something you built with each tear, each sacrifice, and each moment you chose to keep moving forward, even when it seemed impossible. The days following Shani's death were a blur of grief and duty. Meera's young heart, still tender and raw from the loss of her mother, now faced an even greater test. Her father, Devraj, had become a shell of the strong man he once was. The weight of his wife's death was too much for him to bear. His hands, once sure and steady, trembled as he worked the land. His eyes, once full of hope and purpose, were now hollow, as if the very light of life had been dimmed within him. Meera tried her best to take on the roles her father could no longer fulfill. She rose before dawn, the faint light of the morning sky barely breaking through the trees. She gathered wood for the fire, fed the animals, and prepared the small meals for herself and her siblings. Her heart ached with every chore, but it also grew stronger with each passing day. She knew that the family depended on her, and she could not afford to falter. Her brother, Arun, was just 7 years old, and though he had a lively spirit, he didn't quite understand the depth of their mother's absence. He would sometimes run to Meera, his face bright with excitement, asking her when Mama would return. Every time, Meera would smile sadly and say, "Mama is watching over us now, Arun. She will always be in our hearts." And though it pained her to speak those words, Meera knew they were the truth. She had to believe that. She had to hold on to the belief that Shanti's love would continue to guide them from wherever she was. Lila, the youngest at just 3 years old, would often wander around the house, calling out for her mother. The pain in her innocent voice would break Meera's heart all over again. At night, Meera would hold her sister close, rocking her to sleep while whispering stories of their mother. She told Lila how Mama had been strong, kind, and beautiful. She told her that she would always be with them, even if they couldn't see her. But there was one thing Meera hadn't prepared for, her father's grief, which began to take a more tragic turn. It was late in the autumn, when Devraj fell ill. At first, Meera thought it was just the exhaustion from working the fields and mourning the death of his wife, but soon, it became apparent that something was terribly wrong. Devraj's body weakened, his cough worsening with every day. His once strong frame became frail, his appetite diminished, and his once steady hands began to shake violently. Meera did everything she could to help. She boiled herbs from the forest and brewed them into teas, hoping to ease his symptoms. She cleaned his brow with cool water and sat with him through the long, sleepless nights, her heart full of worry. She could not afford to lose him, too. The villagers whispered amongst themselves, sharing their concerns in hushed voices, but no one had the resources to help. The nearest town was a day's walk away, and the cost of medicine was far beyond what Meera could afford. The thought of losing both of her parents seemed unbearable, but she clung to the hope that somehow she would be able to save him. One evening, as the sky turned a dark shade of purple, Devraj's condition worsened. He began to fever, his breathing shallow and uneven. Meera sat by his side, holding his hand tightly, trying to reassure him that everything would be okay, though she knew that wasn't true. She had no more strength left to give. Her father, the man who had always been her rock, was slipping away before her eyes. Meera, Devraj whispered, his voice weak and raspy. You are the strength of this family now. Promise me you will take care of your brother and sister. Tears welled up in Meera's eyes, but she nodded, her heart breaking as she fought to hold back her emotions. I promise, Papa. I will take care of them. I won't let you down. As the night wore on, the light of the oil lamp flickered, casting shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, and the world seemed to hold its breath as Devraj's struggles grew weaker. And then, just before dawn, with a final sigh, her father's hand grew still. Meera, though only 12 years old, was forced to confront a reality she had never imagined. In the span of just a few months, she had lost both her mother and father, two pillars of her world, leaving her to carry the weight of the family on her own shoulders. At that moment, the full extent of her resilience began to crystallize. The grief was unbearable, and the sense of abandonment was overwhelming. How could she possibly do this? How could she raise her brother and sister alone, with no one to guide her? But even in the face of overwhelming loss, Meera found something deep within her, a determination that she would not let this destroy them. She had promised her father that she would take care of Arun and Lila, and she would keep that promise no matter what. She could feel her mother's spirit with her, giving her strength to move forward. She knew that, in the darkest of times, love was something that could never be taken away. Her father's funeral was a quiet affair. The villagers gathered, offering their condolences, but Meera felt as if she was in a dream, unable to truly process the weight of everything she had lost. She clung to her siblings, as if their presence was the only thing that could anchor her to this world. As they lowered Devraj's body into the earth, Meera whispered to the winds, I will be strong, Papa. I will take care of them. The days that followed were filled with a numb kind of routine. Meera did what needed to be done. She worked in the fields, cooked for her siblings, and kept the house in order. But inside, her heart ached. There were days when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. The loneliness was suffocating, and the sense of helplessness was constant. But Meera could not allow herself the luxury of despair. She had no choice. Arun and Lila needed her, and she could not let them down. She held them close, giving them all the love she had left, even when there was little left for herself. In the weeks that followed, Meera began to realize that the strength she needed wasn't something she could simply muster on her own. It was something that came from the love she had for her family, the love that her mother and father had instilled in her, the love that would carry her forward, one step at a time. As she looked out over the fields, the same fields her father had worked, she realized that resilience was not just about surviving, it was about holding on, even when everything seemed lost. She had no idea what the future held, but in that moment, she made a promise to herself that she would carry on, no matter the hardships. She would rebuild their lives. And she would do it with the strength of her parents in her heart. The years passed, and though the pain of loss never truly faded, Meera's life began to take on a new shape. She had grown from the shy, grieving girl who had lost everything into a young woman with a quiet strength that many in the village began to admire. But while her resilience had carried her through the darkest of times, there were still many battles ahead, battles that she never anticipated. At 16, Meera had reached the age when her future began to take form. In their village, the traditional path was clear. Girls were married young, and their lives revolved around their husbands and families. Meera had often heard whispers from the older women in the village about how she had become the heart of her family, a source of strength for her younger siblings. But even the most respected women in the village understood that marriage was the next chapter in Meera's life, a chapter that would bring her both joy and new challenges. One evening, after a long day of tending to the fields and caring for Arun and Lila, Meera sat outside their small home, gazing up at the stars. The sky, a deep velvet black, seemed endless, and she found herself wondering what her life would be like once the responsibilities of raising her siblings faded away. The answer came sooner than she expected. It was during the festival of Holi, a celebration of colors and new beginnings, when the marriage proposal arrived. A young man named Raghav, who had recently returned from a nearby town, had heard of Meera's strength and resilience. He was the son of a well-respected family in the village, and his family had been in search of a bride for him. Raghav had seen Meera from a distance and had been struck by her beauty and, more than that, by the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. His proposal was simple and respectful. He did not ask for a grand celebration, but rather requested that the elders of the village meet to discuss the match. Meera, though hesitant, knew that marriage was a path that would change her life forever. It was not just about her own happiness, but about her family's future. Arun and Lila would now have a new protector, a new guide in their lives, someone who could help shoulder the burdens that Meera had carried alone for so long. After much thought, and with the blessings of her remaining family members, Meera agreed to the match. It wasn't a love story, not in the way that some of the women in the village had dreamed of, but it was a union born out of necessity and mutual respect. Raghav, though kind and respectful, was a stranger to Meera. He had grown up in the town, away from the fields and the daily struggles of village life. But he respected her, and Meera saw in him a steady, if quiet, presence. The wedding ceremony was held under the shade of a large banyan tree, the branches heavy with green leaves. The village gathered to celebrate the union, and the colorful powder of holi stained the air, bright reds, yellows, and oranges mixing together like a living painting. The music of drums echoed through the village, and laughter filled the air. But for Meera, there was a bittersweet quality to the celebration. She had once imagined a different life, a life where her parents would be there to celebrate this moment with her. She missed them, more deeply than ever, but she knew that this was a new chapter, a step toward building something for herself, for Arun, and for Lila. When the ceremony ended, Meera found herself on a journey that she could not turn back from. Raghav took her hand, and together, they left the home she had known all her life and began the journey to their new life. Raghav's family lived in a larger house at the edge of the village, surrounded by fields of crops and a small orchard. Though the house was more spacious than Meera's, it felt strangely empty to her, lacking the warmth of the tight-knit family she had grown up in. But Raghav, though quiet, was kind. He worked in the fields alongside his father and elder brother, and though Meera had grown accustomed to the work, she noticed that Raghav did not have the same connection to the land. He seemed out of place in the fields, though he tried his best. In the beginning, Meera struggled with this new life. She missed the simplicity of her childhood home, the small tasks that had once filled her days. She missed the closeness of the family she had lost. But she also began to see that this new life held potential for growth, for healing, and for rebuilding. Raghav's family was kind, but distant. They were polite to Meera, but it was clear that they didn't understand the depth of her past. To them, she was just another village girl, a new wife. But Meera knew that she would have to find her place here, just as she had done in her childhood home. She could not live in the shadows of her grief. She had to build something new. Days turned into weeks, and Meera began to settle into her role as a wife. Raghav's mother, though loving, often looked to Meera to take on the traditional tasks of a wife: cooking, cleaning, managing the household. At first, Meera struggled with the weight of it all, but she soon realized that her strength lay in her ability to adapt. She worked quietly, but diligently, ensuring that everything in the house ran smoothly. Despite the differences between them, Meera and Raghav began to grow closer. Their marriage was not born of passionate love, but of mutual respect and understanding. Raghav began to recognize Meera's strength, and Meera began to see that Raghav, despite his quiet nature, had a steady loyalty and kindness that made him a good partner. They shared late-night conversations about their hopes for the future, about the lives they wanted to build together. And though their love was not the kind that filled the air with fireworks, it was steady and reliable, like the earth beneath their feet. But even as Meera adjusted to her new life, the echoes of her past remained. She often found herself staring at the horizon, wondering what her parents would have said if they could see her now. Would they be proud? Would they be happy for her? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Meera stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the land that was now hers and Raghav's. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made to give her the strength to survive, and she knew, deep in her heart, that they would be proud of the woman she had become. This chapter of her life was just beginning, but Meera had learned the most important lesson of all. Strength was not about how much one could endure, it was about how much one could give, and how much one could rebuild. As the years passed, Meera found herself not only navigating the complexities of her marriage, but also stepping into a new and demanding role, one that was both a joy and a challenge. She had always been a caretaker, even from the time of her mother's illness, but now, as a wife, she had a new responsibility: raising children. It was a journey that brought new joys, but also new hardships that she had not anticipated. Meera and Raghav were blessed with their first child, a son named Arjun, when Meera was just 18. The news of her pregnancy had brought a sense of warmth to their home, a feeling that their life together had truly begun. Raghav, who had once been distant and unsure, was transformed by the arrival of their child. His eyes, once solemn, now glowed with pride as he held their baby son for the first time. But the joy of Arjun's birth was tempered by the harsh realities of rural life. While Meera and Raghav had made a life for themselves, the village was not without its struggles. There were seasons of drought when the crops failed, and seasons of flooding when the fields were submerged underwater. And despite the hard work of both Meera and Raghav, there were still days when hunger threatened to overtake their small family. Meera, though, had learned how to endure hardship. She had seen too much of it in her own life to be easily discouraged. She worked tirelessly in the fields, even with the burden of caring for Arjun. She would bundle him in a shawl and carry him with her as she worked, keeping him close, the weight of her child a constant reminder of the love she had for him and the responsibility she had to give him a better life than the one she had known. Despite the physical labor, Meera found solace in the small moments, when Raghav would come home from the fields and they would sit together under the evening sky, the weight of the day lifting as they shared a simple meal. Arjun's laughter, which filled their home, was a balm for the fatigue that weighed heavily on Meera's shoulders. But the challenges of motherhood were not limited to the physical work. As Arjun grew older, he began to exhibit a rebellious streak. He was a curious child, full of energy and questions, and though Meera loved him dearly, his constant need for attention often strained her patience. He would run off to play, get into trouble with the other children, and test her limits. Meera found herself caught between the love she had for her son and the demands of being a mother. She tried her best to balance the two, but there were days when it seemed impossible. It was on one of those days, as she found herself exhausted and frustrated with Arjun's antics, that Raghav came to her with a quiet request. "Meera," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, "perhaps we should send Arjun to the school in the town. He's bright, and he could have a better life than we did. It would be hard, but it might give him a future." Meera was torn. She knew that Raghav's suggestion came from a place of love, but the idea of sending her child away from her, especially when he was still so young, filled her with dread. The thought of him growing up without her, without the close bond they had, was terrifying. But at the same time, Meera understood the importance of education. She had never had the opportunity to attend school, and her heart ached at the thought of Arjun missing out on the chance for a better life. After much thought, Meera agreed. She and Raghav made the decision together. They would send Arjun to the town to learn. Though it was one of the hardest decisions Meera had ever made, she knew it was the right one. She wanted a future for him, a future where he could escape the cycles of poverty and hardship that had defined her own life. The day Arjun left was one of the hardest moments Meera had ever faced. She held him tightly in her arms before sending him off, her heart full of both hope and fear. "Go, my son," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Learn everything you can. Make us proud." As Arjun walked away, his small figure disappearing into the distance, Meera couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. It was as if a piece of her heart had walked away with him. In the months that followed, life continued on. The days were long and filled with work, But Meera found herself thinking often of Arjun. She would write letters to him, though they were few and far between, and when he returned for the holidays, his face was full of new knowledge, new ideas. But each time he left, it became harder to watch him go. Meanwhile, Meera had two more children, Daya and Kavi, both of whom brought more joy and complexity to her life. With each new child, the demands on Meera's time and energy grew. She was no longer the young girl who had learned to survive in the face of hardship. She was now the mother of three, each with their own needs, their own dreams. But just as before, Meera's resilience was tested in new ways. There were nights when the weight of motherhood and the care of her family seemed almost too much to bear. But in those moments, Meera would remember her own mother. She would remember the quiet strength that Shani had shown, the way she had always given so much of herself, even when it seemed there was nothing left. Meera knew that this was the same strength that she now carried within herself. She had learned to give without asking for anything in return, to love unconditionally, and to sacrifice her own needs for the sake of her children's futures. As the years passed, the family's situation slowly began to improve. The crops were better, and Raghav's work in the fields began to yield fruit. But it wasn't the wealth or the abundance that Meera valued most. It was the love that filled their home, the bond she had with her children, the joy they brought into her life, and the resilience they had inherited from her. Meera had once been a girl who carried the weight of her family's survival on her young shoulders. Now, as a mother, she carried that same weight with grace. Each day brought new challenges, new sacrifices, and new joys. And in those moments, when she watched her children laugh and play, or when she held them close after a long day, she knew that all the hardship she had faced had been worth it. For the first time, Meera allowed herself to believe that, despite all the pain, there was hope for the future. She had learned that love, sacrifice, and resilience could build a life worth living, no matter the struggles. The years had not been kind to Meera, yet they had not broken her either. The landscape of her life seemed to shift continually, as if the earth itself conspired to test her resolve. With every passing season, new challenges arose, some small, some enormous, but she had learned that survival was more than just existing. It was about enduring and finding ways to thrive even in the most difficult of circumstances. As Arjun grew older and continued his education in the town, Meera's role as mother and caretaker for Daya and Kavi grew more demanding. Her life had become a constant balancing act between the needs of her children and the unforgiving demands of the fields. Every morning, she woke at dawn, and the rhythm of her day was dictated by the sun's rise and set. She cooked, cleaned, tended to the crops, and made sure that the household ran smoothly. Though Raghav did his part in the fields, the weight of the work was still hers to carry. Despite the strain, Meera had never considered giving up. It wasn't in her nature. There were days when she found herself wishing for a reprieve, for even a few hours of rest, but the demands of life never seemed to stop. The constant cycle of work, of caring for her family, of making ends meet, wore on her. Still, she found solace in her children's laughter, in the small moments of joy that they brought into her life. But as time passed, Meera began to feel the toll of her sacrifices. Her health began to decline. The once youthful energy that had carried her through long hours in the fields now began to fade. There were days when her body ached from head to toe, when her bones felt brittle and her hands trembled from exhaustion. Yet, despite her fatigue, Meera never allowed herself to stop. She kept pushing forward, knowing that her family needed her more than ever. It was during one particularly brutal drought season that the first major test of Meera's strength came. The monsoon rains, which were usually dependable, failed to arrive that year. The crops withered in the heat, and the fields turned to dust. Raghav, who had always been hopeful and steady, became more and more anxious with each passing day. They had enough food to get by for a few weeks, but what would happen when the reserves ran out? In those days, the village felt the weight of the drought. Farmers who had once prospered now struggled to feed their families. The water in the well had become scarce, and the nearby river, which provided irrigation for the fields, had dried up. Meera could see the worry etched in the faces of her neighbors, but she didn't have the luxury of letting fear consume her. She had to keep moving, for the sake of her children, for the sake of her family. One particularly harsh evening, as the sun sank below the horizon and the heat of the day clung to the air, Meera gathered her courage and made a decision. She would venture to the town to seek help. It was a long and dangerous journey, one that would take her through unfamiliar roads and uncertain terrain. But she had no choice. Her children needed food, and Raghav was too frail from the lack of nutrition to make the journey himself. With a determined heart, Meera packed what little food she had left and set out on foot. The journey was grueling, and the sun seemed to scorch her skin, but Meera refused to stop. Her mind was focused only on one thing: survival. The town, though only a few days' journey away, felt like another world to Meera. It was bustling with activity, a place full of people and shops that seemed to promise a life beyond the limits of her village. But Meera had no time to admire the beauty of the town. She was here for a singular purpose: to find food for her family. Her first stop was the market, where vendors were selling vegetables, grains, and other essentials. Meera had no money to buy food, but she knew that there were those who might be willing to barter. She approached a grain merchant, an older woman with weathered hands and a kind face, and explained her plight. The woman listened quietly, her eyes soft with sympathy. After a long moment, she reached behind her stall and handed Meera a sack of rice, beans, and lentils. "Take this," she said. "It's not much, but it will keep your family fed for a while. Come back when you can pay." Meera's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't allow herself to cry. She could not afford to show weakness. Instead, she nodded her gratitude and took the sack, promising to return when the rains came, when the crops could once again be harvested. With the food in hand, Meera made her way back home, the weight of the sack heavy but her heart light with relief. But the journey back was no easier than the first. She walked for days, her feet sore and blistered, her body exhausted from the strain. But she refused to stop, refusing to let her children go hungry. When Meera finally returned to the village, the sight of her standing in the doorway with a sack of food was nothing short of miraculous. Raghav's weary eyes filled with relief, and Daya and Kavi ran to her, their faces lit up with joy. Meera had done it. She had kept her promise. In the days that followed, Meera's strength became the cornerstone of the family's survival. Though the drought persisted, the food from the town allowed them to make it through. Meera continued to work tirelessly in the fields, hoping that the rains would come soon. The weight of the drought was still heavy, but with each passing day, Meera grew more determined to ensure that her family would not fall victim to the harshness of nature. But the drought was only the beginning of their struggles. As the dry season wore on, illness began to spread throughout the village. The lack of water and food weakened the immune systems of the villagers, and several families fell ill with fevers, chills, and fatigue. Meera, whose body was already worn from the strain of the drought, now found herself caring for the sick. Daya, her youngest child, fell ill first. It started with a high fever, then chills that made her little body shiver uncontrollably. Meera's heart sank as she held her daughter in her arms, knowing that there was little medicine or treatment available. She used the herbs she had learned to gather as a child, boiling them into teas, but nothing seemed to ease Daya's suffering. For the first time, Meera felt helpless. She had always been the one to take care of her family, to be the rock they leaned on, but now she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She couldn't protect her children from everything. She couldn't shield them from the realities of life. But just as she had done when she was a child, Meera dug deep into the well of her strength. She stayed up all night with Daya, singing lullabies to ease her pain, refusing to let her daughter feel the weight of the illness. She spoke words of comfort to her, words that she herself needed to hear. "Daya," she whispered softly, "you are strong, just like your mother. We will get through this together." And they did. Slowly but surely, Daya began to recover. The fever broke, and the color returned to her cheeks. But the experience left Meera with a new understanding of survival. It wasn't just about enduring the external hardships of life. It was also about holding on to hope in the face of despair, about believing in the strength of your family and in the power of love. The seasons passed, each one bringing its own set of challenges, but the one constant in Meera's life was Raghav. Though they had not started their marriage with great passion, over the years they had built a quiet, steady love based on respect, shared hardships, and mutual care. Together, they had weathered droughts, floods, and the struggles of raising their children. Meera had never imagined that she would find comfort in such a steady, unassuming partnership, but over time, Raghav had become her anchor. He was her strength, the one person who had been there through it all. But as time wore on, Raghav's health began to decline. At first, it was subtle. He grew tired more easily, often complaining of aches and pains in his joints. He was less able to work the fields as he once had, and though he insisted it was simply old age creeping in, Meera knew in her heart that something more was happening. The once strong man who had stood beside her through all the years of hardship was now fragile, his body no longer able to withstand the weight of his responsibilities. Meera tried to ignore the creeping fear that grew inside her. She had learned long ago not to show weakness, not to acknowledge the things that were too painful to confront. But the worry gnawed at her, even on the busiest of days, when she had to care for the children and manage the household. Raghav's once strong frame seemed to shrink by the day, and the weariness in his eyes was something she could not ignore. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, Raghav collapsed in their small home. It was sudden, a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Meera rushed to his side, her heart hammering in her chest. He had always been the rock of their family, and seeing him so weak was terrifying. She lifted him into her arms, trying to soothe him, but he was no longer able to speak, his breath shallow and labored. Raghav's illness was swift, far more aggressive than Meera had expected. The doctor in the village came, but there was little he could do. The diagnosis was grim. Raghav had contracted a severe chest infection, compounded by the years of hard labor and the toll the drought had taken on his body. There were no resources in the village to provide the kind of medical care he needed. Meera's mind raced as she thought of ways she could help him, but she knew, deep down, that the battle was beyond her. For days, Meera stayed by his side. She fed him what little food they had, helped him sit up to drink water, and held his hand through the long nights. The once vibrant man who had carried their family was now a shadow, and as the days turned into weeks, Meera began to feel the crushing weight of their reality. One night, as the moonlight spilled through their small window, Raghav stirred. He looked at Meera, his eyes cloudy with fever, but filled with love. He reached out to her, his hand trembling as he grasped hers. "Meera," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak. I'm so proud of you. You are everything I ever hoped for and more." Meera held back tears. "Raghav, please don't talk like that. You'll get better. We'll get through this together. Just like we always do." But Raghav smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile, and shook his head. "No, my love. I don't think I have much time left. Promise me that you'll take care of the children, that you'll keep them safe, no matter what happens." The words, though gentle, were a knife in Meera's heart. She could feel her entire world slipping away. But she nodded, gripping his hand tightly. "I promise, Raghav. I will take care of them. I will keep them safe. You don't need to worry." In the early hours of the morning, just as the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, Raghav took his last breath. Meera was holding his hand, just as she had promised, when he passed away quietly, leaving her alone with their children and the weight of everything they had built together. The loss of Raghav hit Meera like a wave. It was a deep, crushing grief that seemed to suffocate her. She had lost her partner, the person who had been by her side through thick and thin. But more than that, she had lost the only person who truly understood the weight of the sacrifices she had made, the struggles she had faced. For days, Meera couldn't bring herself to leave their home. The empty space where Raghav had once sat felt unbearable. The sound of his laughter, the way he would hold their children in his arms, was now a haunting memory. The house felt colder, quieter, and Meera found herself questioning how she could move forward without him. But as much as Meera wanted to retreat into grief, she knew that she could not. She had children to care for. She had to be strong for them. She could not let the pain of loss consume her. In the days following Raghav's death, Meera threw herself into her responsibilities. She arranged the funeral with the help of the villagers and took on the task of explaining to her children what had happened. Arun, now a young man, returned from the town, and though he was devastated by the loss of his father, he knew that the family needed him. Daya and Kavi, still so young, struggled to understand why their father was gone, but Meera did her best to explain the concept of death in a way they could comprehend. "We must honor him," Meera told them softly one evening as they sat together by the fire. "We honor him by continuing to live, by taking care of each other. He wanted us to be strong." And in that moment, Meera knew that her strength would have to come from within, not just for herself, but for her children. She had lost Raghav, but she had not lost everything. She still had her family, and they still had each other. They would survive just as they always had. Though the pain of losing Raghav would never fully fade, Meera slowly began to rebuild. The days were long, and the nights were often lonely, but she had learned that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about facing it head-on, with the courage to move forward. She would carry Raghav's memory in her heart, but she would also honor his legacy by ensuring that their family would continue to grow, continue to survive. And so, despite the overwhelming loss, Meera found the strength to continue. She would keep her promise to Raghav, and she would raise their children with the same love, wisdom, and resilience that had carried her through so many hardships. In the face of loss, Meera found new strength, the kind that only comes from having to keep going when you don't think you can.